You've landed on The Substance, a podcast aiming at being biblical, thoughtful, and human. Join us each week as we engage the culture without the culture war. I'm your host, Trevor Aiken, joined by my co-hosts, Philip Marinello.
Hey, everybody.
And Vincent Edwards.
Howdy, howdy.
All right, it's back. And special guest joining us this week is Kaitlyn Schiess. Welcome, Kaitlyn.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Kaitlyn is an author and a recent doctoral student now, right?
About to be in the fall.
About to be in the fall.
Congrats.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
So Kaitlyn is the author of The Liturgy of Politics. We're here to talk about the book, but also just kind of the ideas surrounding it. So, Kaitlyn, a couple of things before we start. The full title of your book is The Liturgy of Politics, Spiritual Formation for the Sake of Our Neighbor. And who did the cover of your book design? This is a fantastic cover.
It's great, and it's the IVP in-house guy. I don't remember his name right now, but it's funny. It is totally not what I imagined it looking like, especially with the red and the blue and the white. Like, it looks sort of patriotic. But I love it because I also think it might attract some people who might not otherwise pick it up to pick it up. So that's good.
100%. I love it. Right off the bat here, I think we should get to some definitions. So I'm thinking liturgy, politics, and spiritual formation. How would you define those for our listeners?
Yeah, so all pretty important words and words that we might misdefine if we're not careful. So in the book, I describe liturgy and spiritual formation pretty similarly, actually. Liturgy is anything that is repeated and embodied and imparts a larger story or meaning. And so that includes things like, obviously liturgies in churches, the way that, the words we all say together, the sacraments, things like that, but also includes just the habits that we normally have when it comes to media consumption, our relationships, the things we consume, schools, grocery stores, just the regular parts of our lives that are embodied, repeated, and impart some larger story or meaning. And that last part is the part we tend to kind of miss in a lot of the things that we do, that there's a larger story or meaning in a lot of the habits that we get into. And the reason I use liturgy and spiritual formation pretty interchangeably is because I'm using liturgy in a really broad way. And then spiritual formation is really broad too, in the sense that we are formed spiritually by so many things, including spiritual disciplines and the corporate worship of the church, but also including all of those things I just listed, like media consumption and our regular habits in our neighborhoods and things like that. And so part of the point of the book is to say, let's think about both spiritual disciplines and corporate worship and all of the other things that could be malforming us in ways that we might miss. And then political, I also use in kind of a broader than normal sense. A lot of times when we're talking about politics, we tend to just be talking about legislation, elected officials, judges, and the decisions that they make. And those are certainly included, and they're really important in the book. But I wanted to broaden it out to include all of the things that form our common life together. Luke Brotherton has this great book called Christ in the Common Life, and I reference the way that he describes politics all the time because I just think it's really great. He talks about the forming and norming and sustaining of our common life together. And I like that because forming involves things like laws, right? Like we have to have a structure that kind of governs our common life. But then norming is like we have stories and like cultural attitudes and responses to things that justify those laws and elected officials. They can't just be sustained on their own. They're sustained by the common stories we believe and the norms that we have. And so I wanted to broaden that out to say there's more things that are political than we think. And political is not a dirty word. It doesn't mean partisan and it doesn't mean lowly, dirty kind of things. It includes things that God's people were always intended to do throughout creation, which is to seek the flourishing of our common life together.
Yeah, that's super good. You talk about this in your book, and we've actually talked about it too. Our first episode in season 2 was on politics. And we talk about this complaint that somehow the church manages to be too political and not political enough at the same time. And I felt that feeling come through in your book. And I feel like a lot of Christians, when they hear people talking about politics, it's like, well, they're getting off mission, they're getting off book, they're getting off gospel. But you have kind of maybe a corrective to that has a different perspective. Could you explain a little bit about why does it matter? Like for just Joe Schmo sitting in the pew, why should he care what is politics?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The what you said at the beginning there, that we're somehow both too political and not political enough. And I think really what we're getting at when we say that is we're too partisan in the sense that we have melded our identity with a particular political party. For American evangelicals, the Republican Party, we've become too identified with certain political goals as if those are the only ones we're supposed to have, and as if those kind of replace the larger mission of the gospel. And yet insufficiently political in that we, in a ridiculous kind of way, have simultaneously been really involved politically and yet not involved at all with politics as it concerns the vulnerable people in our communities. We've not recognized that what it means to be the church means to care for the vulnerable, including when there are legislative and judicial barriers to their flourishing. Then those become things that we have to be concerned with. And for me, the way that I want to think about increasing our kind of political work in the world and our political attitude, our political character, is not to say let's be more partisan, or not to say let's conflate our broader mission with just a political mission, but it's to say let's recognize that our mission from the very beginning for the people of God, right? Adam and Eve in the garden, given a commission to rule and reign over creation, to seek the flourishing of the communities they're in, right? That includes working the ground and having families. But as more of them are, more humans are around, that's going to include structures and systems to protect people, to seek our common good, to organize our life together. That's been a commission God gave his creation from the beginning. And then it even continues post the fall. One of the first things that God says to Abraham is not just, I'm going to make a nation, I'm going to bless you in these ways, but I will make you a blessing to the nations. You will have this outward orientation to the world. And so that's been continued Old, New Testament. That's the vision that's described, I think, in Revelation, even, of we're not ending up just floating around as disembodied souls. We're ending up working in a city, which is a picture of humans organized together in community. If that's the commission we have throughout all of Scripture, then our identity and mission as the church is in some way political. It's not partisan, and it's not limited to policies and, judicial decisions and things like that. But if we're not involving the political element, then we're missing something about the commission we've been given throughout all of Scripture.
When you say that, you don't hear enough sermons, and I guess this could be anecdotal, but by and large, out there in the church ether, you don't hear enough about God's promise to bless the world through His people. That's definitely something that, growing up, Trevor and we grew up in many decades in the conservative evangelical church, and not that it was never talked about, but that's just not the emphasis. So how we read our Bibles, and with what mindset and what level of active participation of Bible reading, what's that role in spiritual formation?
Yeah. So one of the things that I constantly think about when it comes to how we read Scripture is, and I use this phrase in the book, of the posture that we have more than the rules that we have. I care a lot about method and hermeneutics, but when it comes to just the average person reading their Bible, I like to use the word posture because it includes rules and, what are the right ways to kind of think about things. But it has a more general connotation of just, I want to be in a posture or a position of receiving and of being open to conviction. And the only way that I have that posture is if I am willing to see myself in the story as not the main character and as not the righteous one. And so sometimes, I want to identify at times with someone who I identify a lot of the time with Jeremiah. I'll be like, it is rough out here and no one cares what I have to say and people are mad at me and it is hard. And I get that. But when we overly identify, when we have a posture of kind of coming in and going, I'm the good guy in this story, we miss some really important things, especially in both the Old and the New Testament. This is true, but especially in the Old Testament, of the people of God so consistently being called out for injustice. And too often we look at that and we go, I don't know where I'm at in that story. I'm just kind of a passive observer as someone who's a New Testament believer. But if I'm somewhere in the story, I am like the beleaguered one who is being mistreated. I'm the one who needs to have justice sought for them, instead of I might be the position of the oppressor. My favorite example of this is in Luke, when Jesus is talking to his own people and he's like, I am here to bring justice to the oppressed. I'm here to, give sight to the blind. And they're like, yes, we love this. And then he reminds them of multiple times in the Old Testament when prophets Elijah and Elisha actually sought the people outside of Israel to bring justice to them. And then they respond by being like, we're going to throw you over a cliff now. He's like, I'm going to do these great things. And they're like, cool, that's for us. That's great. Give us the justice. And he's like, hey, remember the prophetic tradition involves going outside of the people of Israel to seek justice for all people. And they're like, just kidding, we don't like you anymore, let's throw you off a cliff. And that's the kind of posture that we can sometimes have, is like looking into scripture and seeing ourselves in a certain kind of position and not the other. The other thing I would say about that really fits into that is, if you are reading scripture individually, and I mean that literally, like if you are alone in a room reading the Bible, that is a good thing and a good habit to be in. And yet, of course, there is no check for you. If you are constantly seeing yourself in the wrong kind of position, there's no one else in a community around you to be like, hey, you're focusing a lot on these righteous characters and you're not focusing enough on the injustice that's being perpetuated in the way that you could be complicit in it in your own context. One of the best examples I've seen of this is a church that's very close to me that I have a lot of close friends that go to, is predominantly immigrant and predominantly people experiencing homelessness. And it is really impossible for people in that context, for anyone to get up in a corporate setting and read a passage of scripture that has to do with the impoverished and the needy, the people who are foreigners that come up so frequently, especially in the Old Testament. It's impossible for them to read those things and not have that put an immediate practical material obligation upon them. Like if you are in a community of all pretty well-off people, no one, everyone is a citizen, especially if you're in a pretty white, predominantly white, wealthy church, and you read commands about serving the poor and the vulnerable, it's really easy to think you're doing that by like sending a check to a ministry every week and not really have the weight of an obligation placed upon you. But if you are in a community where the person in the pew in front of you has an immediate material need that you could meet, and that passage is read out loud, you're going to have a greater obligation upon you to do something about it. So it's both kind of the posture of seeing yourself in a different position in scripture, but part of the way that I think you learn to do that is by recognizing that there is something special about reading scripture in a certain kind of community that evidences the unity that we have in Christ across political, socioeconomic, racial barriers. And just the fact that it is in a community, that it is not you alone, puts you in the practice of being in that kind of posture.
Wow. Yeah, that's really good. I was thinking a couple of instances where, I was like sharing the gospel. I was talking about the gospel with somebody, and he was from a different faith background and had left the faith and was kind of examining the way I was applying the scripture and being very, exegetically driven, how I was taught to be. And it was funny, the word he used for it, he said, you're kind of like a legalist. And I had a different dictionary definition of that word. So I was like, wait a second. Well, and then I thought about it and I was like, actually, I can kind of see how you mean that, because I'm almost being like a lawyer with the way that I approach the scripture and the text and this kind of. And then I started seeing myself as the Pharisees in the Gospels, and it really changed the way I read the Gospels. And so I can definitely,
right?
Yeah. And I can definitely testify to the power, the transformative power the Word of God can have when you start seeing that reality. Well, another thing you talk about, and I think it's interesting because we were talking about the communities that we're in, and I was talking with a fellow believer recently. He was relating this experience to his small group in his church. He was relating this experience to them about how he had seen this person asking for a ride. They're like, hey, I need a ride down to this thing. It's cold. And he was like, sorry, I'm going the other direction. Well, he felt convicted the whole time, like, oh, I should have done it. And so he actually left his event and went and tried to go find the person, couldn't find them, right? So he felt really bad. And this small group basically told him, well, it was probably better because it's not safe anyway. And I think you kind of talk about some of these, you would call that like a gospel, right? Or maybe a false gospel that potentially is being shown or believed to salve the conscience there. You talk a little bit about some of those, what you might see or assess in that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I talk a little bit in the book about the security gospel, which typically when people look at the list that I have here, it's like patriotism, prosperity, security, white supremacy. And a lot of people will be like, I got all of those immediately, but security was like not the one I was expecting. And the reason I think is because it is so woven into the way that we even talk. I mean, when I first was, I think I ended up pulling this out of the chapter because I was worried it would upset people. But I think originally there was a line about like the fact that if someone is going like into missions, the first thing that we just get together to pray for is safety, which is a good thing. It's not a bad thing, but I just have such strong memories of growing up in the church, the hedge of protection. Like I am most concerned with keeping things safe and secure. And having physical security is a good thing. Like, God created us to be in community with people, to be secure in that, to have our needs met. Those are all good things. But in this world, for believers especially, that is not the highest good. And so the fact that someone could look at that situation and not see that there is a good of meeting this man's needs, especially even just the spiritual good of witnessing to him, of showing what it really means to be a Christian in that moment. Like, the fact that you would think that that is a lower good than your physical safety really shows that you don't believe the truth of the resurrection. Like,
Wow,
if the worst case thing is that you literally die, and we believe that Christ has beaten death, has overcome death, then there shouldn't really be anything else that doesn't have the ability, if we are meeting the needs of people, if we are especially meeting their spiritual needs, there shouldn't be anything else that can really kind of top that. And that doesn't mean we aren't wise with our resources and with the choices that we make. As a woman, there are choices that I won't make when it comes to serving people because of safety and security. And those are still good things I encourage people to make.
It's not that you don't exercise any discernment or wisdom about your security. It's that you don't idolize it.
Yes, it is not the number one priority. And often it really is you can tell it's the number one priority because we're not willing to just justify small things for the sake of security. We're willing to justify huge things for the sake of security. The example I give in the book is like, you might think this is just a micro thing. Like, okay, I care about my safety in my neighborhood, or I care about my friend who's a missionary being safe in a difficult country. But that also expands on a macro level to the way that we think about mass incarceration, the way we think about policing. If we think safety and security is the number one thing, then of course we're willing to justify the abuse of people, the mass incarceration of communities, because safety is the priority. But if it's not the number one priority, if justice and peace of communities and the flourishing of marginalized people are also, in fact, greater priorities than that, then we're not willing to justify that for those things. But you can tell how important it is by what we're willing to justify for it.
And an example of that would be like the guys who I know, in my experience, there's more guys who are willing to and excited to serve on the security team than maybe the evangelism team or the
the nursery,
the downtown memory, or the nursery, or anything. But the security team was a popular one.
Nursery and children's church are always the lacking ones.
Yes,
I want to be the guy carrying a gun at church.
Yeah,
the good guy with the gun. So in talking about that, usually what's motivating a particular individual to be safe is because they're scared, or fearful of something. Something's going to harm me, or something's going to harm my family, something's going to harm my community. And I believe you mentioned that fear is a fundamentally antisocial. So talk to us about that circle of self, and how people can better understand that as it relates to fear.
Yeah, so psychologists have done studies, especially about soldiers in war, about the way that fear, just like in our brains, the chemicals that come when we are afraid, are so fundamentally antisocial that we will work against the training that we have to just protect ourselves. And so they've talked about how part of what happens when you're trying to get soldiers into war is like you have to do all of these training exercises to get it to the point where your instinctual response to fear is not to just run and hide for yourself, but to seek the good of the other people that are, involved in a mission with you. And that
on your team, right?
Yeah, on your team. And even that, like the fact that what has to happen is not just, hey, let's seek the good of other people. It's your sense of self has to include other people for you to actually fight that antisocial element of fear. And so that's actually, weirdly enough, psychology and theology are not in opposition. That really is consistent with how scripture describes what we're supposed to do, right? Is not just, okay, now I add other people to my fundamentally sort of selfish idea about things. It's that I am not myself anymore, right? That I belong to a community that is larger than me, and their needs become my needs. And I no longer have the choice of like, it's not really a voluntary thing of like, oh, there's someone in my community that has a need. I can choose to help or I can choose not to. It's like, no, my sense of self has enlarged to the point where your needs are my needs as well. And I don't really have a choice to decide to disregard them, especially when fear is involved. And so that's like the thing about, if we're afraid of people who are different from us, if people in our communities are different from us in any of the various ways that they can be, do I have a sense of self enlarged enough to include people that have differences that socially and culturally I have been told should make it impossible for them to be a part of my sense of self? Or is the gospel really able to break down those divides to the point where my sense of self includes people who are different than me?
Man, that's a good question.
That's awesome. And just to follow up on that, so what would you say is a practical start for an individual who might hear what you just said and say, you know, I agree with that. I think my circle of self doesn't expand very much outside of maybe my family and myself. So how would you encourage an individual to start that process of widening that circle?
Yeah, it's a good thing that the gospel is real and that there is a material effect of what's happening with us spiritually. But for me, I would say, one, evaluate the community that you're in. I wouldn't encourage anyone to just suddenly leave a church that they're a part of, but I would encourage people to evaluate whether or not they're in a church that matches the community that they're a part of. I know a lot of people who, even in my own community, I'm in a really kind of diverse part of Dallas where neighborhoods that are pretty segregated and different kind of push up against each other. And so there's room for a church in my neighborhood to encapsulate all those people and be very different. And so if you're choosing to be a part of a community that has resisted that diversity that is inherent in our community, again, I would caution people against really flippantly changing churches, but that's not a flippant reason. If you're being really careful and you're trusting the Spirit, you're listening to people who are wise, and you're making a decision to be in a community that matches, being in a church that matches the community that you're a part of. Because I don't know other ways other than relationships to have that sense of self enlarged. But the other thing I would say, a lot of people who ask me about this will be like, I'm in a really white part of the country, or like, my neighborhood is super, monolithic. I don't know what to do. The internet and published resources have given us an incredible ability to empathize with people who are different from us that we've never had in the history of, human societies. And so that's also true even if you are building relationships with people who are different from you. Don't put the full burden of understanding diverse experiences of different people on the handful of relationships you have with people who are different from you. Educate yourself outside of that and bring that into the relationships that you have. But I wish that there was a discipline I could give someone to be like, do this 3 times a week and your sense of self will be enlarged. I don't know of another way to do it than being conscious about the kind of community that is forming you.
Yeah. Well, I think it has to be that, right? Because, you talk a lot in your book about how the fact that we are embodied matters, and we're not just like collections of theology walking around. Like we're people living in a real world.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get on from that, I actually wanted to ask one more follow-up on fear. So there was a popular Christian figure who recently had an interview, and his language in describing his kind of transfer into kind of a more conservative pundit, he used a lot of language about especially an election cycle and being terrified of a certain option, a certain political candidate being chosen. He said it was horrific. The option was terrible, horrifying, and he used all of these like very fearful words. And so I think about fear hijacking. It doesn't exist in the rational part of the brain, right? It exists in a much like more instinctual way. You just react. And I wonder if in your examining this, like you're seeing a lot of things that are being driven by fear rather than, and we're trying to interact with people on a rational understanding of, hey, let's go through the issues, but really where they're coming from is they're just afraid. Do you feel like that drives that, and how can we minister to people if that is the case, that they're being driven by fear in their approach to politics in the world?
Yeah, a lot of my conviction, even in wanting to write this book, was to get us to recognize that we think we're having like rational argument kind of conversations about politics. And in reality, so much of what is driving it is emotion, and not in a derogatory way. Like, we are meant to have emotions as humans. They're gifts from God that, are part of what make us who we are. And yet, like all gifts from God, they've been distorted by sin. And so, but that it's not a bad thing, but it is a true thing that we don't recognize very often. And it's not just fear, it's the things that we desire, the things we've learned to love, the sense of self we've been talking about. And so we really have to, I think, go into conversations with that in mind, as you've said, and ask people questions when we think, it's really easy for me when I'm in a conversation like that. Someone says a lot of really fear-based things to just respond with like, here is facts. And those facts should change your mind about what you're afraid of. And I have learned that doesn't really do anything. And in fact, I feel in myself me getting to an emotional place that's not going to be conductive for the conversation either, right? If they're giving me all this fear, I'm probably going to respond with anger or even some fear of my own. It might prompt me to think about the things I'm afraid of and how that informs the things I think politically, because I'm not immune to that either. What I have really tried to do, first of all, is kind of have some mental checks in mind. Like when I feel that thing, for me, it feels like it's in the back of my head that I'm slowly like coming up on a cliff, having kind of checks in myself to pause and breathe and not continue to escalate the conversation, because I feel like we think by responding with facts that we're not ratcheting up the emotion, and sometimes we're bringing just as much with us. But the other thing is to just ask more questions, and ask questions that help you better understand what that fear is, or desire, or whatever the emotional kind of response behind it is. But ask those questions in ways that don't use emotion words. Because if you ask questions with emotion words, like, what are you afraid of? People don't generally respond well. If you're like, what are you so afraid
let me list them for you.
Why are you so angry? Those are not good questions. But if you can, especially if you're talking to a believer, right, we can share this sense of Scripture frequently talks about not being afraid. That's like a constant thing Jesus says, So if you can get to a place where you can really piece out, here are the things you are actually afraid of. Is there a way to gently call out the things that we're not supposed to be afraid of, that we're not supposed to go in with fear as our motivation? But you only get there under like the most safe relationship parameters that most of the time are never a part of the political conversation. And so I say all of that to say, having it outside of the context of a political conversation can also be really helpful, which is difficult to do, right? You get there and you've got the ratcheted up emotion, and suddenly it becomes so clear to you that, gosh, they're afraid of something ridiculous. Like they really believe that so-and-so is going to come and take their kids away, or going to, burn their church down, or like something ridiculous that's not a fear they should have. But then if you can kind of just keep that in your brain and wait until a time when the emotion is lessened, where you can have a conversation about fears and desires and those kind of emotional responses that is separated from the political conversation that ratchets up the emotion, that can be helpful. But it's hard. It's why so often people will ask me questions like this, and I'll be like, I don't have a formula for you to follow in your political conversations. But I will say, as someone who has spent the last 5 years working at a church and trying really hard in a very divisive kind of context to have those conversations, I will have 6 terrible ones before I have a good one. And it's all of the learning from those 6 ones that I bring into the 7th one that makes it good. But if I stop at the first one, then I never get to the 7th one that's finally good.
Wow. So, I mean, that speaks to exactly what you were talking about earlier about the importance of community relationships. Yeah. And I think obviously that's patience and care and love for this individual, not just trying to score points for your team. Yeah. That's good. Speaking about that, so if we're talking about relationships and community, one of the things that I've found an interesting concept, and I thought connected with a lot of your work, is a theology of place. Could you develop that? How would you kind of define that or think of that? Why is that important? And, how does it come up in church ministry?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if this is what you're talking about, but the first thing that I think of that is relevant to this is the recognition that the place that you are in shapes the experience that you are having. And so a lot of low church evangelicals, for example, will just kind of be like, we can worship God anywhere, which is true. We can just kind of be free and spontaneous and, whatever, and it's fine. And yet if you have ever been in a church that was built intentionally with architectural choices that are intended to kind of spark wonder, to spark a sense that the world has more going on than just the material, than just the things we can see, then that does something to you emotionally, that shifts the way that you are feeling and the kind of emotional place that you're in. And it puts you kind of like we were talking about with scripture, in a position of receiving. Like no one can walk into a cathedral and think that they're the big powerful guy in the room. Like no one can really feel like I am in control of my own destiny when you're in a giant church with stained glass windows, when you have visual reminders of saints that have gone before you that suffered things worse than you and yet are remembered hundreds or thousands of years later. And so the faithfulness of God is evident in the pictures of that. Like there's all of these things about the place that we are in. And ironically, a lot of the churches that I grew up in didn't care about that at all. Our churches looked a lot like businesses or like hip coffee shops. And the place that you are in and the things that it looks like shapes what you think you're supposed to do. So if your church looks like a business, you're going to run your church like a business. If your church looks like a hip coffee shop, you're probably going to run it like a hip coffee shop. And there are limits to this, right? If you are a church plant and there's a building that looks like a business and you're going to use it, that's great. That doesn't mean you're inherently you're just stuck with those principles. But it does mean you have to be really conscientious about the way that the place you are in will form the values that you have. Am I going to, similar in a cathedral, right? Am I going to be formed to think that beauty only happens in this kind of way, that there isn't something beautiful about serving in a context that doesn't look anything like this, that is impoverished and dirty? You know, are there going to be ways that I'm malformed by that as well? Possibly, yeah. And so the real heart of the book, to be honest, when it comes to things like place, but when it also comes to just liturgy more broadly, is a lot of us have thought we just weren't doing it. When we were just doing it in an unexamined way. We all have habits of the way that we worship. We all have an order of worship, even if you're at a low church kind of context. You sing 2 songs, someone tells you to give the offering, you sing another song, you sit down and you listen to the sermon, you sing 2 more songs at the end, and then you go home. And if someone messes with that order, you're probably going to be a little discombobulated because your body has learned that order. And so whether it's place or liturgy or the order of our services, we really have to recognize that we are being shaped by that. And other traditions have just been more intentional maybe about it. They could still be malformed by those decisions, but at the very least, we have to be reflective about the choices that we're making and what that's teaching people about what matters, what story we're living into, and what things we're supposed to do in the world.
Yeah. I think too about like the literal where. The fact that I'm shaped by the fact that I was born in America, in the South, that I was on this side of the tracks and not that side of the tracks, that my church exists here in this place and this time. And all of that, the awareness of where I grew up and
the theological heritage where you inherit.
Yeah,
and all that.
and learned about Christianity. Yeah. How do they preach the Bible? Why did they learn to preach the Bible that way? Like, why are you here?
What do they expect the effects of preaching the Bible to be?
Right. And does it, where they learn about Christ, how does that impact how they bring Christ and that ministry into that place in the way that they live their life?
Well, I mean, you bring up the thought in the book. It's not a direct quote, but I was just taking notes as I was listening to the audiobook the last couple of days. So I was just taking notes in my phone. But you talked about how modern people are either thought of, like you said, like non-high church folks. We think we're less liturgical, but we're really just kind of thoughtlessly liturgical.
Yeah.
Like we are formed by the way we intake news and the social media we scroll through, or the podcasts we listen to, or like the routine of our days, whatever they may be. Like those are liturgies. Like even talk about like brushing your teeth, like the things we do have effects on us. And if we are taking kind of no measures to purposefully order our lives and kind of set up how we read our Bible, how we engage with our local community, how we engage with our local church body assembly, like if we're not doing that on purpose, like we're allowing all the forces around us to form us. And I don't think any sort of genuine interpretation of the Bible would say that that's a good thing.
Yeah, and the same is true, I think, of the political world that we're in. So we think, oh, I'm just going to choose to not be political. Like I'm just going to choose to not be involved. And it's like you are being acted upon by political things. You are shaped and formed by it. You don't get to choose to just opt out of it. You are being shaped. And and this is a lot of what I end up conversations I have. I'm in seminary right now. I'm finishing up. I'm with all these people who are going to go and be pastors. And all of the time when people are like, that's just not part of my job. Like if I'm a pastor, politics is a different realm, doesn't affect me at all. what that misses is
Where'd
that
you get
your
that idea?
people are being discipled by Fox News, by CNN, by whatever political, pundit they are listening to, by their Twitter account, and we have a sense of that when it comes to like Hollywood. For some reason, we've struggled to have a sense of that when it comes to DC. And so for you to say, I'm just not involved in politics would be, akin to you saying like, I just don't care about culture. Like, I just don't care because it does, it's just not a part of my church. No, your people are in that. You don't get to act like it's this thing outside of you that you poke and prod. You are influenced by your culture. You are influenced by your politics. And if you're not speaking to it, then you're just allowing them to be discipled by those other forces. And that's to me, a real form of spiritual malpractice, for there to be such a significant impact on people's lives that you've decided, because it might cost you something, you are not going to speak to.
Or even just the amount of time. I don't know if pastors, I think it's definitely a deficit in training.
Yeah.
Because the fact of the matter is, like, man, at most, how many hours a week are people being ministered to by their pastors versus taking in commentary or even actual good news and information, like good solid facts? Like, what's the ratio of that?
Yeah.
And it's to say that, I'm going to have no part in that is, I'd say malpractice is a good word for that.
Yeah, and a lot of churches too just run a lot of programs that are just different forms of Bible studies from a different angle. Yeah. So, I mean, you're getting Bible study on Sunday morning, getting Bible study on Sunday night and Wednesday night, and then every other week at your small group, you're doing a book study, which is basically somebody writing a Bible study, and you're studying that person. It would be
that liturgy does kind of communicate like knowledge is what it's all about.
Yeah, it's like as if we wanted to get stronger, and so we just read books about workouts. Like, do we ever actually go to the gym and do this so that we can build the muscle? So maybe some people could think to use those groups and that opportunity to practice some of this stuff, maybe build some of those relationships.
I reached out to a couple of different people just for questions for you, because like I said, you've done tons of interviews. A lot of them are really good. I'll link some of the ones that I listened to this week, just kind of prepare for this in the show notes. But Karen Swallow Pryor, friend of the show, and hopefully we'll be back soon to talk about Frankenstein. She said, ask Kaitlyn about writing for lay Christians in a wider audience. So the target of this book wasn't necessarily just pastors and people who just nerd out about theology. It was for a wide audience. So
nailed it, by the way.
Was there anything? 100%. I can't wait to put this in people's hands and see what happens.
Yes.
But what kind of precautions or thoughts, like what kind of went into writing a book like this for a wide audience?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. First of all, I just love Dr. Pryor so much. She's just the absolute best. To be honest, when I first was starting to think about writing it, I was really thinking about other seminary students, because I was reading all of these books about political theology and spiritual formation. And I was like, I want to hand 25 books to someone when they graduate who says that they have nothing to do with politics in the life of their church. And they won't listen to that. They're not going to they'll just have been graduated. They don't want more books to read. But maybe I could give them this one, and because they're my friend, they'll read it. And then maybe it will kind of spark some questions, But then as I was writing the book, I had the really great experience of writing the book while I was in seminary with a ton of people that want to be some pastors, some counselors, some writers, things like that. But I also did it while I was working with young adults, people in their 20s and 30s in my church for my job. And one of the hardest things about that job for someone who at that point had already been in seminary for 3 years was realizing how in just 3 years, I had become so isolated in my world of people who read the Bible and read theology all day and who nerd out about the Greek and the Hebrew. And suddenly I was trying to have conversations with people who had jobs that I didn't understand and whose lives were just so far from this. And that sounds so silly, but it really gave me a perspective on, I'm sure if you've been a pastor for 20, 30 years, gosh, you were really disconnected from everyone else's lives. I had to spend a lot of my early relationship building with those women, just trying to understand the career paths they were on, the backgrounds that they had, what they thought about church, things that I was so used to being in an environment where I could say words and everyone knew what they meant, or kind of make a joke about things in the church and everyone would kind of get what I meant. Instead, I was with a group of people that had really diverse church backgrounds, really different vocational paths. And so it really gave me a greater passion, I think, for trying to write something that wouldn't baby people. Like, I don't want to over explain things and treat you like you're stupid, because a lot of stuff, honestly, in church does that. We fall into those two pits of either talking over people's heads or treating them like they're stupid. And especially for women in the church, that's 100% true, that we act like we have to make everything so accessible that everything is on the lowest shelf, and we think things are above people's heads. And I had multiple experiences in ministry in this church where I would be learning stuff in seminary and think, this is so deep, this is so rich. No one's going to care about this. Like, this is complicated. It uses some philosophical language. Like, they're not going to like this. And I had one experience where I was learning all this stuff about the relationships in the Trinity on the cross. And I was like having my mind blown. I was realizing all this stuff I'd been taught that was bad. And I went to Bible study on a Thursday night the next week, and we were reading through, which probably Luke, because that seems like the gospel I would pick. I think it was Luke. And we got to the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus is like, hey, let this cup pass from me. And one of my women was like, okay, so the Trinity, right? Jesus has the same like desire, I guess, as the Father, but like he doesn't want it to happen. So how can Jesus, who's part of the Trinity, not want what the Trinity has decided to do? And I was like, this is the question that we were talking about in class yesterday. We were using philosophical language. We were making it really, theologically complicated. And we acted like no one would ever have this question in our church. And they were just reading the Bible, and the question was obvious right there. And so I wasn't really prepared in that moment to translate all the stuff that I had had in class in language that was accessible to people. But once I had a minute to do that, and I could have a conversation with the people who had those questions, we had the most like theologically exciting and honestly like spiritual relationship building conversation we've ever had. And at the end of it, one of them literally said to me, why has no one ever trusted me to do this kind of thinking before? Like, why has no one ever trusted me to ask these kinds of questions? And so I've had some people say to the book, like, there were words I had to look up, or I was a little confused. I was mediating between two kind of seminary world and church world. But that actually makes me really excited, because I would hope in the church that we could simultaneously not talk over people's heads or act like your intellectual knowledge is the only thing that matters for your sanctification, and simultaneously do that while also saying, we expect you to be good thinkers, and we expect you to ask good questions, and we're not going to treat you like thinking theologically is just for people who are in ministry.
That's really good. Yeah.
Man.
So thinking about end times, a lot of the things that we'll hear when we start to engage politics is, well, it's all broken, but then Jesus is going to come back and set it up right. And so like really what our job is to get people in the kingdom. We preach the good news. We tell people about the gospel, and then they come and they're part of church. And then all this political stuff, like, it's just going to be broken until Jesus comes back. And we're never going to figure it out because we're humanity. And so why bother with it, right? And eschatology is kind of used that way. But maybe really thinking about the end times, thinking about hope, and thinking about, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, there's maybe a different biblical standard or perspective that we should be better informed by on that. Do you care to talk a little bit about what you found about the relationship between eschatology and our worship?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in churches where we just didn't really talk about this a lot. We might, if you went to a certain Sunday school, they would give you a whole chart, and there would be a lot of details and dates and, stuff
Always
like that.
The charts, yes.
But other than that, like on a Sunday morning, we probably didn't really talk about it. But I grew up really strongly with the sense that the goal is just to get to heaven. Like, if I pray the sinner's prayer, go to heaven, that's the end of the story. To the point where I remember being in early high school and reading Revelation and being so confused the whole time because it's confusing, but then getting to the very end, those last few chapters describing new heavens, new earth, all of this really vibrant imagery for the New Jerusalem, and literally going to a Sunday school leader and being like, what? Like, I didn't know this was in here, And so if we have a sense that the end of the story has some really important parallels with the beginning of the story, right? The beginning of the story is rule and reign over creation. They're in a garden, which is a place of, there's some level of human cultivation in a garden, right? But it's still pretty natural. It's this commission to take the good gifts that God has given them and make something with them. Andy Crouch has this amazing book, Culture Making, where he talks about that's what really we're commissioned to do. Take these natural gifts and turn them into human creative things that image God in the way that he is a creator. So if it starts with a garden, but it ends with a city, then there's all of this development that also happens there. That's work of human creativity. It happens because God intervenes in a broken situation that we could not fix ourselves and redeems and restores creation to the point where we can live in community with each other and seek the flourishing of our communities unhindered by sin. But that doesn't mean just because he's the one that makes that ultimate redemptive move, that then we just do nothing. We sit around on clouds and sing songs all day. That sounds boring and horrible. And good news, that's not the end of the story. I really think the end of the story is we have jobs to do like we had in the beginning. And those jobs involve things like figuring out how to live together in a way that creates flourishing for all people. And so if that's the end of the story, why not practice that now in a way in which the work that we are doing can be restored and redeemed and in a very perfected way that might look almost nothing like what it looks like now, but still will be parallels in what we do in eternity, then it's worth doing. And I'm used to saying this to a lot of people. And I actually had a class the other day where we were talking about this. Someone brought up the quote that's often attributed to D.L. Moody, but he didn't actually say it. A radio host said it, why polish the brass on a sinking ship? Sure. And someone brought that up and we all kind of laughed, like no one thinks that. And then my professor, who is brilliant, just kind of enters into the conversation and goes, well, why polish the brass on a sinking ship? Polish the brass on a sinking ship if God told you to polish the brass. Like, the whole idea of the sinking ship is wrong, but even assuming that it is right, why aren't you questioning what God told you to do? He told you to polish the brass, you polish the brass. And he told you to care for the marginalized and vulnerable in your communities, including, I think there's plenty of evidence throughout scripture, including structural barriers to their flourishing. You do it. Like, you don't have to worry about what the relationship is between that and eternity. I think we can theologize about that in some really beautiful ways. But even if we couldn't, God told you to do it, you do it.
Drop the mic.
Yeah.
That's Man, right. Go ahead and drop it. I want to pivot just a little bit. So you kind of have two individuals. You have one individual who is tired. They're seeing what's going on in the kind of political discourse, and they're trying to be faithful to the local church, and they see their leaders kind of submitting to one or more of those four gospels that you explain in your book. Prosperity, patriotism, security, or white supremacy, one or four, or, one of the four. And they're just getting tired and they want to walk away. What do you say to that person? One. And then two, what do you say to a person who is going to be, in a sense, church shopping, or they're going to be in a new area? And so they know that these things are important. And this is kind of more of where it relates to me. I know that these things are important. I want to be plugged into the local church. But I know that I will not, I don't believe I can settle to be, to conform to kind of the normal rhetoric, or to be silent when something should be said. So what do you say to that person who wants to stay plugged into the local church?
Yeah, I mean, to the first one, I would say, and I say this to a lot of questions, even if the question isn't someone who's tired, but if they're just frustrated or they're confused, or start small and local. And really, honestly, I think there's room for turning off some of the national stuff. If the national political stuff is overwhelming and you're tired of it, especially if you're tired of Christians' witness at that level, you are totally free to take a sabbatical from that.
Amen.
And yet, you really don't get to take a real sabbatical from just caring for the people in your community. And so redirect some of that attention that is often sucked in an unproductive way into the national conversation that you can do very little about, besides like tweet about, which doesn't do anything, and really think through very locally what you can do. So in this last election, I had so many people at my church that they had kind of decided which way they were going to vote, but they just felt like they had to talk about it all the time, and there was new information all the time, and I'm overwhelmed with it. And a lot of them, I kind of was like, look, you've thought more than probably necessary about who you're voting for president. But there are 6 or 7 elections in our county for different judges that don't matter to you at all, but will really matter to really vulnerable people in our community whose fates could be decided because of unjust systems, what happens to them for the rest of their life. Are you putting some effort into researching these like 6 or 7 judges that, yes, is effort? Like, that's not probably going to make you not tired, but will it give you a greater sense of connection to your community that could be energizing, and a greater sense of I'm doing something practically good? That the national stuff, you exert a lot of energy and you don't really get any energy back from it. The local stuff, I think you could be energized by your participation in it, and you could see some results. I mean, there's some really great, I think the movie is called The Ordinance. It's a short film on YouTube about a bunch of churches in Texas across the board denominationally. Like, there's Catholic and Baptist and Methodist churches working together because they couldn't get a law passed at the state level to put restrictions on payday loan places. But they, as churches, recognized that those were loopholes, honestly, in the law. Payday loan places should not be legal, that were really harming the most vulnerable people in their communities. They were set up near hospitals, ready to kind of pounce when someone has a medical emergency.
Wow.
They were in really impoverished areas where that seems like the only financial option available, and it put people in a cycle that was destroying them. And so because they couldn't get a state law passed, because again, the higher up you go, the more difficult it is to get things done, they've just, in coalitions together, changed local ordinances at super local levels. And so if you're involved in that, is that exhausting? Yes. But then when that ordinance gets passed, does that give you energy and connection and community that you wouldn't have if all you did was contribute 1 vote to the president? Yes, I think it probably does.
Wow.
So that's what I would say to the first one. To the second one, on one level, and I'm struggling with this myself, I will just be honest. On one level, I am trying to keep my focus on the closest church to me, like physically, geographically, because I live in a city where most of us drive 20, 30 minutes to go to church. And I'm realizing how destructive that is for feeling like you actually belong to a specific community, like we were talking about earlier with place. And so I have been really convicted about if it is loosely within where I can kind of deal convictionally, right? If they're not doing anything that I am going to have a really serious problem with, trying to be as close as possible to just where I live. And this is probably not encouraging, but then just recognizing that I'm going to try and be as faithful as I can and say the truth, not die on every hill, but say the truth when it matters. And then if there are consequences to that and I reach a point where I have to leave, then I do that. But not trying to be too strategic about finding where I fit and where I can stay the longest, or what will cost me the least, or those kinds of things. And so the best metric that I can then have, this is also to kind of push against some of the consumeristic ways we think about church, right? Like church shopping, is to just be like, I'm going to go to literally the closest church to me that broadly fits within denominationally where I want to be. And then if I face opposition that either pushes me out or that I can no longer kind of emotionally be there, then I'll move on. But I'm not going to kind of predetermine if that's the right kind of condition for me, which might not be the right decision for everyone to make, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Wow.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever heard someone approach going to church that way. That's really awesome.
Yeah.
And I think you could really take a biblical approach. I almost feel like you would end up looking like Paul going into the synagogues in the middle of Acts.
Nope. All right. Let me try over here.
But I think there's a faithfulness in that too. So
that's really encouraging. I'd never heard that.
That's super awesome. Very helpful as well.
Good.
Well, Kaitlyn, we're getting close to the end here. Really want to thank you for your time. One of the things we like to do here, it's a little bit on a lighter note. We have a segment towards the end called Substantive Shoutouts. And when we have a guest, we like to share it with them. So what have you been, and it doesn't have to be anything super terribly deep, but what have you been enjoying, reading, listening to, consuming that you've either found edifying in some way or even just enjoyable in a common grace sense? What have you been enjoying recently?
I've been doing a Lent and Easter devotional series, and I think it's called Bread and Wine, but I will let you know if I'm wrong about that. It is just a collection of literally every day is written by someone else, and it has been the part that I didn't expect to be so good for me is how ecumenical it is and how good it is for me in just a very like practical habit kind of way to enlarge my sense of what the church is theologically, as well as like I focus a lot in the writing of the book and in the way that I talk with people about the global church. But this has also helped me in terms of denominations to just think, oh, I'm going to read this thing and I'm not going to agree with every part of it. And yet it's edifying in the parts, whether it clarifies something that's important to me, whether the way they say something is not the way I would say something, but it resonates with me. Like it does something important. It convicts me about something important. I learn something I need to learn. That's just been a really surprising thing. I kind of bought this book being like, oh, I know I should do something every day for Lent. That's not what I've normally been doing, which is reading The Crucifixion by Fleming Rutledge, which is very nerdy of me. And I was like, I want to do something more, accessible that I could recommend to people. And it has really been great. And it's also helped because it goes through Lent. A lot of them go through Lent, but this one really takes Eastertide seriously and then goes through Easter. And having a sense of Lent is 40 days and Easter is 50 because we mourn and we lament and we sacrifice things, we deprive ourselves of things. And then we have 50 days of celebration, and reading these like celebratory devotionals. I feel like a lot of times we think devotionals are just supposed to convict us or teach us something. And these are like celebrating things. And that's been joyful for me.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I'm looking at some of the names on here. And
It's a pretty stacked list.
Yeah, everybody from Amy Carmichael to Dostoevsky to Barth to Oswald Chambers to N.T. Wright to Mother Teresa, I think I saw in there, to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So you really do span the whole spectrum.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Nice. Anything else?
Just to make it really silly, since that was kind of serious, I just got on TikTok.
Whoa.
And
in the dance game?
I have to say, as someone who is mostly studying 100% of the time, just watching silly things on TikTok is really just giving me a lot of joy right now.
Any particular account or series or trend?
Babies doing funny things is just like, that's my sweet spot.
Babies are very cute. Get all the likes. Put up a cute baby pic. Those far and away are the posts of mine that get the most attention. I try to do something thoughtful. Maybe a couple dozen people, maybe. Yeah. Babies. Everybody's like, oh, sweet baby.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Well, Kaitlyn, thank you for your time. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you guys.
We'll put those shout-outs you mentioned in the show notes, as well as some of the things we talked about as well, and a link to purchase the book, as well as we will be if you're listening to this episode, audience, on the week that it is out, we will have both a giveaway for the Liturgy of Politics on Twitter and on Instagram. So pick your platform of choice or enter on both for more chances, and look out for that as well. So thank you, Kaitlyn.
Yeah, we appreciate having you here and talking with you tonight, and we really hope that a lot of people are coming in contact with your work and really take it to heart and are ministered to by it. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Well, guys, that was Kaitlyn Schiess, author of The Liturgy of Politics, and doing such great work. We really appreciated having her on, and hope you guys really enjoyed that conversation.
If you appreciated that conversation and you're not already subscribed on your favorite podcast app, now would be a good time to go hit that subscribe button. And if you really appreciate what you're doing here and you want us to kind of continue to get more good guests, make more good content for you, one of the ways that you can personally help is you can become a monthly partner with us at the anchor link below. Sign up at any monthly amount that makes sense for you. Obviously, times are tough, things are difficult. Obviously not saying, hey, everybody should sign up to give monthly if that doesn't work for you. If you like what we do, if you listen every week that we drop a new episode right away, consider giving us a couple bucks a month. Or if monthly support isn't your bag, there is the Cash App where you can send us single donations. You got some of those extra stimmy bucks you want to send our way. We are at $, the Substance Pod on Cash App as well.
Absolutely. You want to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at the Substance Pod. Like Philip said earlier, we're going to have giveaway for this book by Kaitlyn, as well as other giveaways. So you want to make sure that you are following us, especially on Twitter and Instagram. And that's also where our shout outs are going to be, our upcoming guest. And that's a great place to engage. If you heard something that we said, that Kaitlyn said, that you'd love to engage with, you could either create your own post and tag us in it, or you can comment on any of our posts that we make. And we love to just talk to you and engage in the content, and really just make this podcast a part of the community. So engage with us on social media.
Yeah, we would love to talk with you guys there. Or if you want, you can also email us at thesubstancepod@gmail.com. Or you can even call our phone line. We've got a phone line set up. Call, leave a voicemail, and give us your thoughts. Let us know how the show's impacted you, or show ideas or things like that.
Yeah, we usually say, hey, leave us a recommendation for a show topic or a question. But if you want to just tell us what you like about the show and you want to get your voice heard on The Substance, that'd be awesome.
Absolutely. So you can do that at 913-703-3883. This has been fun again. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time
On The Substance.
Peace.